A signature vanishes from a will, and with it, the shadows of the past stir to life, whispering secrets, threats, and the weight of a fortune lost. In a house haunted by regrets and rivalries, a single stroke of ink will decide the fate of all. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. The spring of 1897 ushered into Baker Street a gentler brightness than I had known for many months. The early hours, so often wrapped in a pall of London smoke, and the ceaseless rumble of hansoms, held that day a rare serenity. Holmes, sunk deep in his armchair, appeared uncharacteristically relaxed, his steely gaze softened by the golden shafts of sunlight that found their way past the heavy curtains. I recall thinking, as I set aside the morning paper, that there are intervals when even the most restless minds are lulled by the promise of tranquility. On such occasions, Holmes was less the machine of logic and more a singularly keen observer at rest, and I, his companion, took comfort in the temporary stillness. It was just as the mantel clock chimed 9:30 that the bell rang, and Mrs. Hudson, with her usual brisk efficiency, announced a visitor. Mr. Charles Lanning, a modest bookseller from Fleet Street, entered, clutching a worn satchel and offering the awkward deference of a man uncertain of his welcome. He bore a sheaf of catalogues and a hopeful air, intent on interesting Holmes in some rare folios recently acquired. Yet it was not his wares that caught my friend's attention. Holmes regarded the man with the faintest glint of amusement. "You have come by way of Paddington, Mr. Lanning," he remarked, before the visitor had uttered a syllable beyond his greeting. "The soot on your sleeve is quite distinct, and your left boot bears a trace of yellow chalk peculiar to the footpath outside that station." Lanning blinked, momentarily confounded. "That is correct, sir, though and you have mislaid an invoice of some importance. I would suggest your satchel's rear compartment," Holmes continued. Our guest, now openly astonished, rummaged through the leather bag and produced the missing slip of paper, his face alight with incredulity. "It is as if you have read my very morning, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed. Holmes smiled indulgently. "Not your mind, sir, only the surface upon which circumstance has written its brief account. Your delay of 20 minutes is evident from the damp upon your boots and the partial smudge upon your collar, a certain sign of proximity to a recent coal delivery at the station. Your invoice, for all its modest value, has quite occupied your thoughts." I watched with familiar wonder as the spell of Holmes's deduction left our visitor both unsettled and delighted, and for a moment I thought the day might proceed in similar harmless display of my friend's talents. It was not to be so. Our gentle interlude was sharply interrupted by a second, far more urgent arrival. The door was flung open with scant ceremony, and a man of no remarkable height, but of unmistakable agitation, burst into the sitting room. He was young, scarcely more than 30, his features pinched with anxiety, his hair dishevelled in the manner of one who had slept little and travelled far. In his trembling hands, he clutched a leather folio. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he managed, voice raw with distress. "I am Roland Blake, assistant to the firm of Larch and Biddle. I beg your pardon for intruding, but I am in the gravest need of your counsel, matters most urgent, most perplexing." He faltered, breath catching. "A signature, sir, the signature of Lord Edwin Malbury, lately deceased, gone, quite vanished from his last will and testament." Holmes was on his feet in an instant, his eyes kindling with that cold fire I had come to recognize as the harbinger of intrigue. "Compose yourself, Mr. Blake," he said, with a gentleness that belied his intensity. "Pray take a seat, and let us hear the particulars from the very beginning." As Mr. Blake struggled to master his emotions, Holmes motioned for me to pour a glass of brandy. The young solicitor's assistant, having steadied his nerves, described how Lord Malbury, a man of distinguished lineage and considerable means, had drafted a new will on his deathbed, one which would, if valid, alter the inheritance of his entire estate. Yet, when the document was brought to the firm's vault the morning after his passing, the signature beneath the bequest was gone, utterly vanished, with neither tear nor blemish to mark its absence. Blake's voice trembled as he recounted the discovery, his anxiety sharpened by a sense of personal responsibility. Holmes's questions came in quiet, precise succession, each drawing out some fresh nuance in the strange affair. The authenticity of the witnesses, the security of the document, the possibility of substitution or forgery. With every answer, the case grew only more confounding. I could see that Holmes was enthralled, not merely by the puzzle of a vanished signature, but by the emotional shadows that hung over the matter: fear, suspicion, and the ever-present weight of mortality. It was clear, as our visitor recounted the tale, that we stood at the threshold of a mystery which defied the ordinary limits of reason, and I, for one, felt the old thrill that comes with the opening moves of a case destined to challenge the great detective's powers to their utmost. Mr. Roland Blake, as he sat opposite us upon the narrow settee, presented the very portrait of a young man caught in the tightening coils of professional distress. The brandy I had poured remained untouched in his hand, his gaze restless and never quite meeting my own. As he endeavoured to collect his thoughts, I observed the marks of sleepless nights beneath his eyes, and the tremor of anxiety that ran through him like a live current. When at last he spoke, his words tumbled out in a halting torrent, sometimes urgent, sometimes almost pleading, as though the telling alone might lessen the terrible weight of the mystery that had befallen him. Holmes regarded him with a composure that was almost clinical, but I, less schooled in such detachment, found myself moved by the sincerity of Blake's distress. There was an innocence to his perplexity, an almost boyish honesty that bespoke both the seriousness of his charge and the fearful possibility of failure before the law and before his own conscience. Blake unfolded the tale in a series of desperate, hurried details. Lord Edwin Malbury, a man of venerable years and diminishing health, had resolved, not 2 weeks prior, to set his worldly affairs in order. With the assistance of the legal firm to which Blake belonged, a new will was prepared, duly witnessed, and, so Blake asserted, signed by the hand of the dying lord himself. The document, of great import and carefully worded, was entrusted to Blake's care for safekeeping in the firm's vault. Yet when, on the morning following Lord Malbury's death, Blake produced the will for formal certification, a most unaccountable discovery awaited him. The signature, which had been present in clear black ink beneath the final bequest, had vanished, utterly effaced, leaving the parchment otherwise unmarred and whole. No tear, no alteration, no mark of forgery, only the blank space where the testator's name had once stood. The shock of this revelation left Blake nearly speechless before his superiors, for never in his brief career had he encountered such a confounding and, to his mind, potentially ruinous event. It was in Holmes's nature to fix upon the wider implications of any legal conundrum, and his questions now turned with keen deliberation to the matter of inheritance. Blake explained that the old will, which would take precedence if the new were deemed invalid, conferred the entirety of Lord Malbury's estate upon a distant cousin, Augustus Malbury, a man of title but, by repute, little warmth. The new will, whose missing signature rendered it unenforceable, named instead a beneficiary hitherto unknown to the London legal world. Miss Clara Dunstow, a schoolteacher of modest means and no apparent claim save for the late lord's recently awakened conscience. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I saw in his bearing that subtle shift which signalled the transition from polite curiosity to the cold, precise machinery of deduction. "The contrast in airs," Holmes murmured, "suggests motive on both sides, Mr. Blake. You are wise to suspect that this is no ordinary mishap of ink and parchment." At this critical juncture, there came a gentle knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a woman whose very presence seemed to draw the atmosphere taut with expectation. Miss Clara Dunstow, slight of frame and plain in dress, yet possessed of a quiet dignity, entered with a nervous composure that belied the gravity of her circumstance. Her eyes, clear and searching, fixed upon Blake with a kind of mute appeal, as if to seek reassurance in the midst of her uncertainty. She spoke softly, but with resolve, affirming that Lord Malbury had spoken often of his intentions in her hearing. "He wished to set right what he called an old omission, sir," she said, her voice trembling only at the edges. "I saw him sign the will. He told me it was my safeguard." Holmes offered her a chair and listened with that peculiar attentiveness which could neither be hurried nor deflected. I could not help but notice the burden of hope and fear in Clara's every gesture, as if the future itself hung in balance with the restoration of a single missing mark. Holmes, now fully engaged, directed his attention first to the specifics of the ink, the paper, and the procedure by which the will had been executed and stored. He pressed Blake and Clara for the minutiae, the sort of quibbles that in less skilled hands might seem pedantic, but in Holmes were the very sinews of detection. Had any stranger approached the vault? Was the pen left out of sight? Had the document felt damp or brittle at any time before or after its signing? Each inquiry, posed with unhurried precision, gradually illuminated the emotional landscape of the case. Blake's gnawing sense of responsibility, Clara's silent dread of returning to obscurity, the late lord's ambiguous affection, and the shadow of avarice that so often lurks behind the facades of respectability. Holmes's eyes shone with an almost eerie delight, for he sensed in the vanished signature a problem which defied both chance and malice in equal measure. "It is not merely a question of whose name has disappeared, Watson," he remarked, his gaze distant and speculative, "but of what invisible hand, chemical or otherwise, has removed it. The law deals in absolutes, but nature, and perhaps conscience, is apt to deal in subtler shades." In that moment, I perceived that our tranquil morning had given way to a case which promised both the intellectual challenge Holmes so prized and the moral uncertainty that so haunted its innocent victims. The following morning found us upon the road to Hampshire, the events of the previous day still fresh in my recollection. The telegraph, which Holmes dispatched to the local authorities and to Miss Dunstow, had secured for us the courtesy of access to Malbury Manor. Our journey was conducted in the comfortable, if austere, silence that so often preceded Holmes's most sustained periods of thought. I have long since ceased to measure the distance between Baker Street and the countryside in miles, for it is the change in atmosphere, rather than in geography, that most impresses itself upon the mind. The city's pulse faded behind us, replaced by the languor of wide green fields and the slow, inevitable approach of an ancient house, its silhouette marked by age and a certain grandeur gone to seed. Malbury Manor, when we arrived, stood as both a testament to lineage and a monument to loss. The lawns had grown wild about the edges, and the air of neglect hung heavy in the hedges and the shuttered windows. Within, the corridors seemed to swallow sound, the walls bearing the melancholy hush that lingers after the last rites have been read. I could not help but reflect that such places, though rich in stone and memory, are most impoverished by the sudden absence of a master's voice. Holmes, unaffected by sentiment, surveyed the estate with that clinical detachment which served him so well. Yet I fancied that even he could not altogether ignore the quiet sorrow that haunted every corner of that once vivid home. We were greeted by Mr. Carswell, the family butler, whose appearance was at once the embodiment of propriety and a study in guarded reserve. His greeting was courteous, yet I discerned in his manner a certain circumspection, a weighing of words before they left his lips. Holmes questioned him with careful civility, eliciting from the man a chronology of the will's custody. When it had been signed, who had witnessed it, and how it had passed from Lord Malbury's trembling hand to the solicitor's care. Carswell answered with precision, but not with ease. He described, almost ritualistically, the sequence of events in the library, the ink pot set precisely at the Lord's right, the two witnesses standing in silent attendance, the document folded and sealed by Mr. Blake. Yet, at certain inquiries, the butler's eyes flickered. A subtle glance toward the drawing room, a fleeting tightness at the mouth when Holmes raised the question of who last handled the key to the vault. There was no outright falsehood in Carswell's account, but neither was there the clear ring of innocence. Holmes, sensing this, pressed no further, instead noting with quiet satisfaction the way the butler's gloved hands trembled ever so slightly when presented with the firm's ledger for verification. In that brief exchange, I felt the first prickle of doubt that all was as simple as it seemed, a doubt that Holmes, I could see, shared and stored away for future use. The second interview of the day was with Augustus Malbury himself, who received us in the small, book-lined parlour he had temporarily made his own. Augustus was a man of some 40 years, of a height and bearing that spoke of generations bred to command, but whose features were marred by the faintest sneer of entitlement. He greeted Holmes with what could only be termed as polite indifference, and as for me, I felt myself measured and dismissed in a single appraising glance. Holmes, ever patient, directed the conversation toward the old and new wills. Augustus professed a lack of interest in legal technicalities, suggesting with a thin smile that such matters were best left to the professionals. Yet in every inflection, every studied nonchalance, I detected the simmering impatience of a man who already regarded the estate as his own by right. When Holmes alluded to Miss Dunstow's sudden elevation, Augustus's response was a brittle laugh. An act of charity, no doubt, and one the law is unlikely to honour in the absence of a signature, he remarked. The phrase hung in the air, a calculated slight, yet too pointed to be entirely insincere. Holmes pressed further, touching delicately upon Augustus's own scientific studies at university and his general attitude toward the late Lord's affairs. There, for the briefest instant, a shadow passed across the man's countenance, but it was gone as quickly as it came. As we withdrew, Holmes's gaze lingered upon a small chemical stain upon Augustus's cuff, a detail he filed away with all the others, saying nothing, but betraying his growing suspicion that the matter of the vanished signature was not only a question of ink, but of character. Our last interview of the morning was with Mrs. Ketteridge, the housekeeper, a woman whose years at Malbury Manor had etched both loyalty and sorrow into every line of her face. She greeted us with a curtsy, but her composure wavered as Holmes, with gentle persistence, questioned her about the final days of Lord Malbury's life. The names of visitors, the movements of staff, even the airing of the Lord's study. Nothing escaped Holmes's inquiry, and each question seemed to strike a hidden nerve. At the mention of Miss Dunstow, Mrs. Ketteridge grew visibly anxious, her hands twisting in her apron. She spoke of the kindness the late Lord had shown the young woman, of quiet conversations overheard in passing, and of letters burned at the master's instruction. When Holmes inquired whether anyone had tampered with the Lord's writing instruments or desk, the housekeeper hesitated, her eyes filling with a sadness that went beyond mere professional concern. "I did my best to keep everything as it was, sir," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "But the house was so full of strangers those last days. There are secrets, I think, that will not rest easy in this place." The admission hung between us, fragile and unresolved. As we took our leave, I was struck by the sense that beneath the surface of duty and decorum, the staff of Malbury Manor carried wounds that the passage of time had not entirely healed. Holmes, walking in silence beside me down the shadowed corridor, gave no outward sign of his thoughts, but I knew he had drawn yet another thread from the tangled skein of our mystery, one that, if carefully followed, might yet lead us to the heart of the matter. Upon the conclusion of our interviews, Holmes requested admittance to Lord Malbury's study that we might examine the physical evidence at its source. The room itself bore the marks of recent upheaval, a faint scattering of ashes on the hearth, a chair hastily pushed from the writing desk, the lingering odour of spirits which spoke of both solace and finality. Holmes set about his work with characteristic precision. First, he inspected the ink well, lifting it delicately to the light and swirling its contents against the glass. His nostrils flared minutely, and he withdrew a thin, ivory-handled penknife to prise a flake of residue from its rim. The ink is of good quality, but faintly more acidic than I would expect for ordinary correspondence, he remarked, his tone half to himself, half for my benefit. He then examined the paper upon which Lord Malbury's will had been written, holding it at various angles, testing its flexibility and scrutinizing the surface for abrasions. Notice, Watson, how the parchment feels brittle here, and yet shows no sign of erasure or scraping. It is as if the ink itself has withdrawn from the fibres, leaving only the shadow of its former presence. At Holmes's direction, Mr. Blake fetched the key to the family safe, a sturdy iron box secured in a niche behind a panelled wall. The document within was inspected anew. Holmes lingered over the witness page, his fingers running gently along the bottom edge. The witnesses' signatures remain intact, yet the testator's name has vanished as if spirited away. He fell into a contemplative silence, only breaking it to inquire as to whether the will had ever been removed from the premises or exposed to unusual environmental conditions. The negative response seemed to satisfy him. Yet I could sense a building energy, a sense that the mystery's fabric was beginning, ever so slightly, to unravel beneath his touch. From the study, we proceeded to the document vault, a modest chamber lined with ledgers and strong boxes, whose air was tinged with the dryness peculiar to places long kept under lock and key. Holmes paused upon entering, his senses alert, and I saw him inhale sharply, nostrils widening as a faint, acrid tang met his nose. He paced the narrow space, pausing at intervals to inspect the stone walls, the hinges of the safe, and the discoloured flagstones below. Producing a small vial from his coat, he dabbed a drop of the liquid upon a scrap of cloth taken from the shelf. "There is a chemical scent here, Watson, faint but quite distinct. Not the ordinary must of age, nor the lingering odour of ink, but something sharper, almost metallic." He glanced over his shoulder at Mr. Blake, who shook his head, professing ignorance as to any recent cleaning or repair. Holmes drew a pocket lens from his waistcoat and knelt beside the safe, examining the base for signs of tampering. "Note this subtle discoloration, a residue almost invisible to the naked eye, as if some substance had been handled here and left to evaporate." He replaced the lens, eyes thoughtful, and spent several minutes methodically questioning the staff about the vault's recent use. All denied any knowledge of intrusion. The atmosphere grew heavier as we returned to the hall, for it was clear that we had crossed from the realm of legal conundrum into one of calculated manipulation. Holmes, for his part, was silent, but the resolute set of his jaw told me he was already assembling the pieces of an unseen design, one that bound ink, paper, and human motive into a most perplexing knot. It was as we made our way back toward the main staircase that my suspicions, long quietly fermenting, coalesced around Mr. Carswell. The butler had appeared at every critical moment, his presence a silent shadow upon the proceedings. His answers, though never openly false, seemed always 1 degree removed from candour, and I found myself recalling the faint tremor in his hands, the evasive glance when Holmes pressed upon the matter of the vault. I broached my unease to Holmes as we retired briefly to the morning room. "You must admit, Holmes, that Carswell's behaviour is peculiar in the extreme. He alone possessed the means to access both the study and the vault. His knowledge of the household is second to none. If this is a crime of opportunity, surely he must be considered a prime suspect. Holmes, who was polishing his lens with a clean handkerchief, regarded me with a trace of indulgent amusement. "You are not alone in your suspicions, my dear Watson. Indeed, Mr. Carswell's conduct might tempt the casual observer to leap to just such a conclusion. Yet, I would urge caution. Guilt may manifest in the innocent when pressed by grief, loyalty, or fear of implication. The surface is often deceptive, and it is the depth of the current we must judge." He rose, crossing to the window and gazing for a long moment at the wild gardens beyond. "Remember, Watson, that a red herring is most effective when it swims against the prevailing tide. I counsel patience. We must let the facts, not our instincts, guide us. It is seldom the most obvious suspect who proves in the end to be the architect of mischief." Holmes's words, calm and unhurried, settled my mind, though not entirely. In my heart I clung to my doubts, uncertain whether I had glimpsed the true workings of guilt or merely the shifting play of shadows in a house still haunted by loss. It was with this sense of unresolved tension that we prepared for the next stage of our inquiry, the answers lying hidden, as ever, just beyond the reach of ordinary vision. No sooner had our investigation at the Manor commenced in earnest than a sense of urgency pressed upon our every movement. Augustus Malbury, with the confidence of a man who saw the world as his rightful inheritance, wasted no time in making his intentions plain. The ink was scarcely dry upon Lord Malbury's death certificate before Augustus engaged his solicitors, their formal communications delivered with a steely promptness to every interested party. The date for the legal hearing was set. Within a fortnight, it would be determined in whose hands the future of the estate would rest. Holmes, for his part, appeared unmoved by the parade of legal documents and imperious letters that now arrived with increasing regularity. Yet I could sense in him a quiet acceleration, a sharpening of purpose which signalled the proximity of crisis. Every detail was reviewed, every testimony weighed with that peculiar intensity which marked his greatest cases. The ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed to grow louder as the day of reckoning drew near, and I found myself gripped by a restlessness that was not wholly my own, but which pervaded the house and all those within it. It was as if the very walls anticipated a struggle between justice and expedience, and only the thinnest thread of evidence separated the two. Amidst this atmosphere of gathering storm, an incident occurred which shattered any lingering notion that the affair was but a dry contest of documents and law. One morning, as I sat with Miss Dunstow in the small withdrawing room, she received a letter, unsigned, written in a cramped, unfamiliar hand. Its message was as brief as it was sinister. Silence is the condition of survival. The paper bore no seal or watermark, yet its threat was palpable. Clara's face, already pale from strain, drained further of colour as she handed the note to me with trembling fingers. Holmes examined the letter with clinical care, noting the paper's origin, the ink's composition, and the oddity of the phrasing. "Whoever penned this," he observed quietly, "wishes to instill fear while concealing his own connection to the crime. The threat, Watson, is at once a warning and a lure. Our adversary grows anxious. Such boldness is seldom the hallmark of one who is certain of victory." Clara, to her credit, bore the intrusion with outward composure, though I could not help but notice the deepening shadows beneath her eyes and the way her hands unconsciously sought the safety of her lap. From that moment, the investigation shifted. It was no longer a matter of ink and parchment alone, but one in which danger, unseen but real, crept ever closer to those most vulnerable. With the passage of each day, Holmes's attention turned ever more to the physical properties of the lost signature. His experiments, conducted with meticulous patience in the Manor's small laboratory, brought forth results both perplexing and illuminating. He compared samples of ink from Lord Malbury's study with those found in the will and subjected them to a series of chemical tests: solubility, acidity, reaction to heat, and various reagents. The breakthrough came one late afternoon as I watched him, sleeves rolled, his sharp features bent over a row of glass slides. "Observe, Watson," he declared, holding up two nearly identical pieces of parchment. "Ordinary ink, when exposed to moisture, will blur and run, yet this ink fades to nothing, leaving no mark. There is a reagent at work, oxalate, perhaps, or some variant, which, in combination with the original solution, gradually destroys the visible trace, but only after a delay." He placed the slides beneath my lens, and I saw for myself the ghostly remnants where once the signature had stood. "The culprit is not a thief, but a chemist," Holmes continued, his tone grave. "This is a crime of patience and calculation, Watson. The ink was sabotaged to vanish only after Lord Malbury's death, leaving the will intact in all respects. But the most crucial, the method is ingenious. The motive, I suspect, is not far behind. The revelation cast our case in an entirely new light, one where time itself was a conspirator, and every detail demanded scrutiny anew. The discovery prompted Holmes to dispatch me on an errand of delicate inquiry, to learn all I could of Miss Clara Dunstow's life before her association with Lord Malbury. My investigations took me from the modest schoolhouse where she had taught with quiet diligence to the humble lodgings she had occupied in the city's less fashionable quarters. Everywhere I went, I was met with the same refrain: a woman of unblemished reputation, given to acts of kindness, yet shadowed by an air of loneliness that none could quite explain. One former employer, an elderly widow, recounted with fondness Clara's gentle manner with children and her steadfast honesty, even when circumstances might have excused a little cunning. Another spoke in hushed tones of Clara's mother, a lady once employed as a companion in a great house, the very house, I soon learned, that would become Malbury Manor. Here, in the convergence of past and present, I sensed the outline of a story too complex for mere chance to have arranged. The pathos of Clara's position, both heir and outsider, struck me forcibly, and I returned to Holmes with a fresh appreciation of the tangled motives which bound all the players in our drama together. Holmes received my report with the briefest nod, his mind already racing ahead to connections I could only dimly perceive. That evening, as we sat together in the waning light, he spoke at last of the deeper undercurrents he discerned. Lady Malbury, Watson, was a woman of strong passions and fierce loyalties. There is evidence in her correspondence of a quarrel, one which precipitated the dismissal of Clara's mother many years ago. The presence of the girl in the new will is not merely an act of conscience, but, I believe, a gesture of atonement. The estate is both a legacy and an apology, and therein lies the true source of danger. The secrets of the past, he mused, have a habit of refusing the grave. In seeking to redress one wrong, Lord Malbury has stirred resentments that run deeper than ink. In Holmes's voice I heard not triumph, but a rare note of pity, for Clara, for the household, and even for those whose ambitions had led them down darker paths. The night settled quietly about us, yet I felt, as I closed my journal, that the story was not yet done with us. Old wounds, once exposed to the air, bleed anew, and justice, even when it arrives, is seldom unaccompanied by pain. The events of the preceding days had convinced Holmes that the struggle for Lord Malbury's estate would not be fought solely within the chambers of the law, but would, before its close, require a contest of wits and, perhaps, a test of nerve. Thus it was that we found ourselves stationed in the quiet darkness of Malbury Manor, lamps extinguished, senses alert, our vigil concealed by the thick velvet of midnight. The entire house was hushed, but for the faint tick of a clock on the landing, each hour drawing us nearer to a reckoning. Holmes's demeanour was unyielding, his eyes narrowed in contemplation as he surveyed the hallway outside the vault. Desperation, Watson, is a more dangerous adversary than mere greed. Our antagonist acts not only to profit, but to erase the traces of his crime. His words, spoken barely above a whisper, filled me with a tension I could not entirely master. The shadows seemed to deepen, the silence to press upon us from all sides. Yet I found solace in Holmes's composure. So long as he remained steadfast, the darkness would yield to reason in the end. Our patience was at last rewarded, though the manner of its arrival was sudden and fraught with peril. A soft scuffling at the far end of the corridor, the muted creak of a door. These were the only harbingers of movement before a cloaked figure, half hidden by the folds of his garment, slipped into the vault. The intruder moved with the furtive haste of one well acquainted with fear, pausing only to fumble through a sheaf of documents before selecting a folded paper and striking a match. In that instant, Holmes was upon him, silent, swift, his grip iron-strong upon the assailant's wrist. The match fell, guttering on the flagstones. The struggle was brief. The would-be destroyer, though desperate, was no match for Holmes's trained resolve. I lent what aid I could, pinning the fellow's arms as Holmes drew him into the lamplight. "Let us see the face of our midnight visitor," Holmes intoned. "We shall discover, perhaps, whether it is guilt or fear which has led him to such extremity." It was with a jolt of recognition that I beheld the intruder's features, drawn, unshaven, marked by hardship, but unmistakable in their resemblance to Mrs. Ketteridge, the housekeeper. The man shrank from Holmes's gaze, though not, I thought, from conscience but from shame. Holmes, never one to let sentiment obscure his judgment, examined the man's belongings with methodical precision, producing from his pockets not only the scorched paper, but also a letter addressed in the hand of Augustus Malbury. The revelation was soon complete. The intruder confessed, in broken tones, to being the housekeeper's estranged son, returned to the manor under an assumed name, and pressed by circumstances into the service of another's scheme. He spoke of debts, of promises made and threats delivered, of a desperation so acute that even crime itself seemed, in that hour, the lesser of two evils. Holmes regarded him not with anger, but with the melancholy understanding reserved for those whose moral collapse is born of necessity, not choice. Yet Holmes's questioning, gentle though it was, soon revealed the limits of the young man's knowledge. He had been paid, handsomely he admitted, to destroy a particular cache of documents, to create confusion and uncertainty at a critical hour. The name of his employer, though never spoken, was implicit in every hesitation, every guarded glance. Holmes pressed no further, content with what he had gleaned, that this was no mastermind, but a pawn in a game he barely understood. "Your role in this affair, though not innocent, is far from central," Holmes pronounced quietly. "You are a tool, wielded by one who fears discovery and acts not from passion but from calculation. The greater crime lies elsewhere, Watson. This is but the shadow, not the substance." With that, he instructed the young man to remain in the custody of the local constable, pending further inquiry. The web, though tangled, was beginning to reveal its design. It was not until the following morning, as Holmes and I sifted through the evidence and testimonies thus far amassed, that my friend unveiled the final piece of the puzzle. There is, Watson, a detail which has troubled me since first I perused Augustus Malbury's curriculum vitae. You will recall he attended Cambridge, where he distinguished himself in the study of chemistry. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of revelation. He was, by all accounts, intimately familiar with iron gall ink and the properties of oxalate solution, the very reagents necessary for the crime we have witnessed. Holmes retrieved a notebook, its pages filled with Augustus's neat script and chemical formulae. Here, in the margins, are notes concerning the preparation of a disappearing ink, entries too precise to be dismissed as idle speculation. The stains upon his cuff, the residue in the vault, the slow, methodical disappearance of the signature, all point to a mind trained in the discipline of patient deception. Holmes's tone was free of malice. There was instead a kind of sombre respect for the adversary who had matched him, if only briefly, in intellect and cunning. Yet there was no triumph in his bearing, only the steady resolve that justice, however delayed, would at last prevail. The final confrontation was now inevitable, and with it, the truth would at last be brought into the clear light of day. The decisive hour arrived with a solemnity befitting the matter at hand. At Holmes's request, all principals in the affair convened at the local magistrate's chambers, a modest but dignified hall where the rule of law stood unchallenged by title or inheritance. The atmosphere was taut, the assembled company fraught with anticipation. Augustus Malbury sat erect, his features schooled into a mask of composure, though I fancied I detected the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Clara Dunstow, pale but resolute, occupied a seat beside her solicitor, her gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the table before her. Holmes himself was a figure of calm intent, his every movement measured, his expression revealing nothing of the storm that gathered behind those keen grey eyes. It was in this charged silence that Holmes performed an act which electrified the room. Producing, from the folio provided by Mr. Blake, a single page purportedly bearing Augustus Malbury's signature, he laid it before the magistrate. "I have here, gentlemen, what appears to be a supplementary codicil to Lord Malbury's will, witnessed and signed, or so it would seem, by the late Lord's cousin." The effect was immediate. Augustus's hand shot out, seizing the paper with an alacrity at odds with his previous indifference. "This is preposterous," he protested, his voice ringing with indignation. "I have signed no such document. This is a fabrication." Holmes regarded him with an icy equanimity. "And yet, Mr. Malbury, you recognize the implications of such a forgery. You see, as we do, the absurdity and danger of manufacturing a signature where none exists. The question remains, however, who stands to benefit, and who, by his very protest, reveals a knowledge of more subtle methods." The room was abuzz with murmurs. Augustus's composure, once unassailable, began visibly to fray at the edges. Holmes advanced with characteristic precision. "There are, perhaps, those among us who know not only how a name might be affixed, but how it might be erased. Mr. Malbury, your studies at Cambridge were not limited to the classics, but extended to the field of chemistry, a discipline which has, in this case, proved pivotal." Augustus, who had taken refuge in a studied silence, now looked up, his eyes blazing with an emotion I could only describe as terror, thinly veiled by outrage. "Why should I, of all people, be suspected? It is absurd," he sputtered, but the conviction had drained from his tone. Holmes pressed on, his voice cool and unwavering. "You have betrayed yourself, sir, not in what you have done, but in what you knew could be done. The slow vanishing of the ink, the precise timing, the absence of any overt tampering, all are the hallmarks of an intellect trained to conceal its designs beneath the surface of the obvious. The effect was devastating. Augustus's composure, so long his shield, began to crack, a faint tremor passing through his hands as the eyes of the assembly turned inexorably toward him. With all attention fixed upon the accused, Holmes drew from his case a second document, one which he had, I later learned, treated with a carefully prepared chemical solution. "If it pleases the court, I ask that you examine this parchment," he said, his tone deceptively mild. What was once invisible now stands revealed, the true will of Lord Edwin Malbury, its signature restored. The magistrate, after a moment's hesitation, held the page aloft. There, beneath the final clause, in a hand familiar to all who had known the late lord, the signature stood forth in bold relief, its presence as incontrovertible as if it had been freshly penned. A gasp rippled through the chamber. Augustus Malbury blanched, his lips moving soundlessly as the reality of his defeat washed over him. Holmes addressed the gathering. By means of the simplest chemical reversal, the mark which was designed to fade has been compelled to return. The mechanism of the crime, ingenious as it may be, has failed to withstand the scrutiny of reason and science. For Clara Dunstow and all those assembled, the revelation was at once a vindication and a profound release. The tangled skein of suspicion had at last been untwined, and the hand of justice, so often delayed, now moved inexorably forward. Holmes concluded with the last, irrefutable piece of evidence. There remains, Mr. Malbury, the matter of the chemical reagent used in this affair. In the course of our investigation, we discovered within your travel trunk a vial containing oxalate solution and a handkerchief stained with the selfsame compound found upon the vanished signature. He produced the vial and handkerchief for the magistrate's inspection. These items, coupled with your documented expertise in chemistry and the sequence of events, leave no doubt as to your role in this enterprise. The motive is clear, the method, though subtle, is revealed, and the guilt inescapable. Augustus slumped in his chair, all defiance gone. Holmes's summation, cool and meticulous, brooked no reply. The evidence, woven together with relentless logic, drew the final curtain upon the stratagem which had threatened to dispossess an innocent and stain a noble house. It was, as ever, Holmes's blend of intellect and moral purpose that delivered the truth, not by force, but by the relentless pursuit of fact. In the wake of Holmes's revelation and the irrefutable evidence arrayed before him, Augustus Malbury's proud facade finally gave way to fury and despair. No sooner had the magistrate pronounced the first words of formal censure than Augustus erupted, his voice rising above the assembled company with a bitterness honed by years of silent expectation. "You speak of justice," he cried, his words quivering with contempt. "You prate of law and virtue while fortune strips me of all that should have been mine. Am I to be cast aside, supplanted by a stranger, by the whim of a dying man, and the machinations of those who seek to curry favour with his memory?" He swept the courtroom with a gaze that burned not only with wounded pride, but with the raw anguish of a man who had built his life upon the certainties of inheritance and entitlement. "You, Clara Dunstow, you step into my place with the quiet step of the undeserving. All these years, was I not the true son in spirit, if not by blood? Yet I am left to bear the blame, to carry the shame, while you," his voice broke, the final words lost in a surge of tears he struggled manfully to suppress. Holmes, standing at my side, watched the scene with a mixture of pity and stern resolve. I sensed in him not triumph, but the sober recognition that justice, when it arrives, seldom does so without cost to the soul. The drama of Augustus's outburst ended as swiftly as it began. The magistrate, his face grave and composed, signalled to the constables, who stepped forward to place Augustus under arrest. The defiant nobleman resisted neither their approach nor the firm but respectful touch of their hands. His struggle was over, the energies of resentment and ambition spent in that final public undoing. Holmes and I stood quietly apart as the procession filed from the chamber. It was not in our nature to gloat, nor did Holmes indulge in the satisfaction of a battle won. He watched with an air of grave contemplation, his gaze resting momentarily upon Augustus as he passed, then shifting to Clara, whose ordeal had been endured with a composure beyond her years. Outside, a spring rain had begun to fall, its gentle rhythm upon the windows lending a kind of benediction to the sombre proceedings within. I reflected that, in the end, justice may be slow in coming, yet when it arrives, it does so with a clarity that admits no ambiguity, however tangled the path that leads to it. In the subdued hush that followed Augustus's removal, Clara Dunstow sat quietly at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her head bowed in the manner of one who has endured a storm and finds herself, unexpectedly, in tranquil waters. The magistrate addressed her with the courtesy due both to her station and her character, pronouncing her the rightful heir to Lord Malbury's estate. Yet there was no flush of triumph in Clara's countenance. Instead, I saw in her a profound, almost chastened gratitude, a recognition of the peculiar fate that had delivered her from obscurity and into the glare of family secrets and legal tumult. She thanked the court in a voice that trembled only slightly, expressing her intention to honour the memory of the late lord by using her newfound means to aid those whose need was greatest. Holmes offered her a brief approving nod as she rose to depart, and I, in my own clumsy fashion, did what I could to reassure her that the burdens of her inheritance would, in time, give way to a gentler peace. I could not help but feel that though her victory was tinged with sorrow, she had emerged from the ordeal with a dignity that put all questions of birth and claim to quiet rest. As the courthouse emptied and the business of the day was concluded, Holmes drew me aside, his manner thoughtful and unusually reflective. "There is an aspect of this affair, Watson, which the official record may never disclose, but which bears upon its moral complexion." He spoke then, in low tones, of a discovery made in the course of his investigations, that Clara's mother, long before her service in the Malbury household, had once been betrothed to Lord Edwin himself, a union sundered by family pride and circumstance, but not, it would seem, by lack of affection. It is no accident, my friend, that Lord Malbury's final testament favoured Clara. It was, I suspect, an act of conscience as much as generosity, a redress for wrongs that could never wholly be undone. The knowledge cast the entire case in a new light. Clara's inheritance was not the mere product of caprice or pity, but the last gesture of a man who sought, at life's end, to weave together the frayed threads of duty, regret, and love. Holmes regarded me with a gentleness rare in his austere nature. In our business, Watson, justice is seldom pure, but if there is any comfort to be drawn, it lies in knowing that, for once, the past has given way to the promise of a better future. The words lingered in my mind as we made our way out into the rain-soaked street, the sound of distant bells marking the hour, and with it the quiet close of a chapter both tragic and, in its own way, redeemed. In the quiet that followed the resolution of the case, Holmes and I retired to our modest chambers at the local inn, the weight of recent events still pressing upon my thoughts. It was there, in the comforting haze of lamplight, that Holmes, as was his custom, set about reconstructing for me the intricate chain of circumstances that had culminated in Augustus Malbury's undoing. It is often the case, Watson, that the solution lies not in isolated facts, but in the order in which they present themselves, Holmes began. He spoke of Lord Malbury's declining health, the hasty drafting and witnessing of the new will, and the subsequent disappearance of the vital signature, a series of events that, when viewed in proper sequence, revealed a design too deliberate to be mistaken for misfortune. From the moment Augustus learned of the New Testament, he set about the slow work of erasure, concealing his actions beneath the veneer of familial concern. The destruction of evidence, the anonymous threats, and the orchestration of distractions all served to mask the central truth: that a single act of chemical cunning, executed at the precise moment, could reshape the fate of an estate and all those bound to it. With his customary clarity, Holmes turned to the science at the heart of the mystery. "You will recall, Watson, the peculiarity of the ink," he said, gesturing to the notes he had compiled. What at first appeared to be ordinary iron gall was, in fact, adulterated with a measured proportion of oxalate, a reagent chosen for its slow, almost imperceptible action upon the ink's composition. When exposed to the moisture and faint warmth of the sealed vault, the oxalate acted as a silent destroyer, erasing only the line where Lord Malbury had set his name, yet leaving the witness's hands untouched. He described the care with which the solution had been prepared, the necessity of exact timing, and the subtlety with which the alteration had been accomplished. The criminal relied upon the confidence of those around him, trusting that the absence of visible tampering would confound both lawyer and heir alike. It was not brute force, but the patient work of intellect, a method chosen to evade all suspicion and ensure that the law, blind to the invisible, would serve his ambition. As Holmes spoke, I marvelled anew at the ingenuity and danger concealed within so simple an act as the signing of a will. Holmes then catalogued the seemingly inconsequential clues which, taken together, had betrayed the author of the scheme. There was, first, the faint chemical scent in the vault, a note so subtle that only a trained nose might detect it. Then the brittleness of the parchment, a telltale consequence of its prolonged exposure to the oxalate solution. Most telling of all was Augustus's own behaviour, his studied indifference to the process, his too casual remarks concerning the fragility of legal instruments, and above all, the chemical stains upon his cuff and in his luggage. "It is a peril of the criminal mind, Watson," Holmes continued, "to underestimate the significance of what it cannot see. In striving for perfection, Augustus left himself vulnerable to the smallest oversight, and it was in these oversights that his ambition found its undoing." His tone, though unyielding, was not without a certain compassion. For even in guilt there are layers of human weakness that deserve recognition. As Holmes finished his account, I found myself contemplating not only the logic that had brought us to this point, but the deeper implications of the case. It had been my privilege for many years to witness Holmes in his element, to marvel at the unerring clarity of his reason and the relentless pursuit of truth that animated his every action. Yet it was in cases such as this, where logic was pitted against secrecy and justice weighed against human frailty, that I perceived the true scope of his genius. Holmes's detachment, often mistaken for coldness, was in fact a safeguard against the chaos of passion and prejudice. He had seen through the smoke screens of guilt and grief, not by denying their existence, but by acknowledging them as part of the fabric of the world we inhabit. In the final reckoning, it was not the law alone, but the steady light of reason, guided by a quietly humane spirit, that had restored order to the lives upended by Lord Malbury's last will and testament. It is a lesson I have carried with me ever since, that justice, when tempered by understanding, serves not only the innocent and the wronged, but even those whose flaws have brought them, at last, into the full and honest gaze of truth. In the days that followed our return to Baker Street, I found myself haunted less by the intricacies of the case than by the subtler burdens it left behind. The business of Lord Malbury's will had been resolved, yet the legacies it scattered were not only of land and gold, but of memory, tangled, persistent, and inescapable. As I observed the slow restoration of routine to Holmes's life and my own, I could not help but consider how the fortunes of a family are shaped as much by the unspoken griefs and vanished hopes of generations as by legal instruments and public ceremony. Every room in Malbury Manor, I reflected, must echo with recollections of kindness and regret, of duties failed and loyalties kept. Clara's inheritance, though just, would forever carry the shade of loss, And Augustus's fall, so sudden and complete, was as much the product of old wounds as of present ambition. It seemed to me that every estate, like every soul, bears within it not merely the marks of what is passed on, but also the shadows of what is never said, never forgiven, never set entirely to rest. It was on one such evening, the fire dwindling in our hearth and the city shrouded in mist, that Holmes himself spoke with an unusual gravity. You see, Watson, there are signatures which the law may erase, and yet they remain etched where the eye cannot see. There are debts likewise that no magistrate can collect, for they are paid or left unpaid in the conscience alone. He turned to me, his gaze contemplative. We are summoned time and again to settle disputes over the visible, ink on paper, coin in the coffer, title on the land. Yet it is the invisible, the wounds of pride, the claims of love and guilt, which truly bind or divide a family. Our profession, for all its focus on fact and evidence, is more often concerned with those who trust too much in what may be written, and too little in what is felt. He fell silent, and I sensed in him the weight of so many cases past, their lessons woven quietly into the fabric of his singular mind. As I set down these final lines, I'm compelled to wonder, was Augustus Malbury truly driven only by greed, or was his fate the inevitable fruit of a long neglect, of love denied and kinship left to wither in the cold soil of custom? The answer, I suspect, lies as much in the hearts of those who judge as in the actions of the one who stands accused. For every crime, there are causes unspoken, pains endured in silence, and a reckoning which, when it comes, reaches far beyond the letter of the law. And so I leave it to you, reader, to ponder with me. Is justice ever truly served by the exposure of guilt alone, or must we also account for the silent signatures that linger in memory, shaping destinies unseen? In the ledger of conscience, which mark endures the longest, the name upon the page, or the ache that time cannot erase? As the last echoes of the case faded, I could not help but voice my lingering thoughts to Holmes. It is remarkable, Holmes, how a single vanished signature unravelled so much sorrow and deceit. Do you ever wonder what drives a man to risk everything for a name on a page? Holmes regarded me with a keen, contemplative gaze. My dear Watson, it is not the ink that carries power, but the meaning we assign to it. Ambition, regret, love, or fear. There are marks, visible and invisible, that shape a destiny far more than any signature ever could. Before we close, I have a question for you, dear listener. In this mystery, do you believe it was greed, fear, or something else that truly compelled the criminal's actions? What would you say was their fatal miscalculation? Share your theories in the comments below. Was the villain's greatest error in chemistry, conscience, or trust? If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases, and share this story with friends who love a puzzle as much as you do.